Right, we're now live. Okay, so I shall make myself the host. I'm back to being the host again, that's fine. Good. Okay, so all we have to hope now is that we get some people joining us. Well, that's one.
Yeah, people will might be just watching online.
Yeah,
so that's fine.
Good evening.
Hello, Erica. Good evening. Have you, Narine, I was going to ask you, given your field of study, have you ever come across a lady called Rebecca Ellis?
No.
No, she's a barrister, but she works for the Home Office, and she's leading the sort of law discussions with the EU at the moment. So she's spending about 3/4 of her life in Brussels, in spite of the fact that she has a 1-year-old and a 4-year-old at home.
That must be difficult. No, I haven't come across.
Okay.
Yeah.
She's from Mansfield, so not far away.
Can we just make the three of us then on the screen, or just two, or just Nara?
I think, yeah, we can do that. That's okay. So if I do spotlight you first, I don't know whether I can actually. Is it going to allow me to? Yes, spotlight for everyone. That's one. And then Narine, I want to spotlight, add spotlight.
Well, hello.
And that's fine. Yeah, no, that's okay. So it's just the two of you basically.
What
I'll just
about
appear.
you?
Pum?
What about you?
That's fine. I'm quite happy being off to one side.
Oh, that's
I can change it as and when we get through, but maybe I'm not going to bother. So it's right. I'm going to make Wendy co-host as well, so she can admit people. Two people have entered the waiting room, David and Linda.
Got there first.
Oh, well done. I'll leave it to you in that case, Wendy. I won't interfere.
Okay then. All right.
Good evening, Glenn. Good evening, David and Linda.
Good evening,
Rabbi.
Sorry. Nice to see you all. Thank you for coming.
Hello, Tanya.
Well, good evening, everyone. Now, Mike is going to mute us all first, and then we will start our evening with Mike introducing our guest, and then me.
Okay. Right. Hello, everyone. For those who don't know me, and in case there are people streaming who don't, I'm Mike Harris. I'm a member of Nottingham Liberal Synagogue, and I'm privileged this evening to chair this conversation between Rabbi Tanya Sakhnovich, who's the rabbi at Nottingham Liberal Synagogue, and the Lord Mayor's chaplain for this year as well, and Professor Narine Ghazaryan. Narine is an associate professor at the School of Law at Nottingham University. She obtained her PhD in EU law from Nottingham University in 2010. She also holds a master's degree in EU law. Narine is Armenian, and her family and she comes from Nagorno-Karabakh, and clearly has been quite profoundly affected by the recent dispute there. So just for housekeeping, you're all muted. If you want, if you're invited to speak, then we'll ask you to unmute yourself. If you've got a question, I'd appreciate it if you could just put it onto chat. So, if there's a lot of questions, Tanya and I will try and select the ones to go. Otherwise, we'll invite people to put their own question. So I'm going to hand over to Tanya now.
Well, good evening, everyone. And I'm so pleased to have Nara with us today. Nara and I have become such good friends because we have a few things in common. We both remember what it was like growing up in the Soviet Union and the blessing of Russian language, which has helped many people in the post-Soviet era to stay connected. We both know what it is like to leave your homeland and move to the promised land. We both people who have had suffering a lot in the past, and we both, more indirectly for me through the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and more directly for Nara through her immediate family and the recent war in Nagorno-Karabakh, became part of two nations in deadly conflict, which takes so many innocent lives. It was painful for me to see your suffering, Nara, and your family through the recent war, and feeling that I couldn't help at all. So I'm so pleased that you agreed to take part in this conversation about the destiny of so many people whose lives are in the hands of so few people of power. Can we ever resolve conflicts between nations? But that is going to be our last question. I would like to start our conversation with your memories, with your childhood memories about the war.
First of all, I'd like to thank Michael and Tanya for organizing this event kindly and for your kind introduction. I'd like to say that Tanya has supported me a lot through these 2 months, which have been the first months of my grown-up life. So she has been very kind indeed, and she has helped me a lot. And also through organizing this event, I'd like to thank her and Mike, because it's not an obvious topic that people might necessarily worry about on a Thursday night. So I also appreciate that whoever has decided to join the talk. Now, this conflict and the Second War that I have witnessed in different forms in my life had obviously been a huge part of my past, my identity. It turns out it's something you can't run away from, even though I thought I did. Yeah, my childhood has been affected from it from the age of 7. When the Armenian independence movement, or the movement for unification with Armenia, recommenced in Nagorno-Karabakh, and I say that because it has never died down. Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh were never happy with the fact that they found themselves as part of Azerbaijan, and many attempts to go back to Armenia in the Soviet Union were quashed because the center was too strong. And only when it was permissible to talk about national issues under Gorbachev's rule, Armenians did feel safe enough to go and protest en masse about rejoining Armenia. For me, what that meant is some strange sense of excitement, seeing in my parents, but then it also, a lot of strange things were happening where I couldn't go to school for a long time, and I loved going to school. So I was very unhappy that I couldn't go to school. And then, yeah, it was pretty dangerous around our city, which I come from Stepanakert, so the main city in Nagorno-Karabakh. We found ourselves in a blockade, and when more organized the war was started by Azerbaijan, we for a long time, many months, lived in bunkers. We had to change bunkers because some weren't safe, and we were relentlessly bombed. For a few months, we had to actually live in our village where we had a summer house of my grandparents. It was safer because that it was quite high enough that wasn't bombed. And later, when the bombing has become aerial, my parents had sent me and my brother to Armenia to live with my aunts, and they stayed behind. And our street was bombed. where 22 people were killed after that bombing, and my father was heavily injured. My mother and grandmother were also injured, but likely my father had to have many surgeries afterwards, including recovering a piece of his skull. He didn't have half his lungs, and he was young and fit. That helped him to survive. So my memories of war was a lot of devastation, destruction, years of missed school, and then coming back to an economically destitute area, very many years of hardship. So it was all pretty dark, but somehow as kids, probably we didn't understand the severity of everything that was happening. And only with this war, I started to realize what it must have meant for my parents to have 3 kids on your hands, and you can't provide their basic safety, even food at times of blockade. Yeah, and the war has scarred us all, but it continued. We sort of learned to live with it for decades. It took my father 20 years to rebuild that house, which was his father's house. And he managed to live there only for 7 years with his family, since they had to leave their house again now. I think I'll stop there. If I take so much time to answer every question, we won't finish tonight.
Thank you very much. And
Thank you.
I'll be asking the next question.
Yeah, I mean, I think the evening is about listening to your experiences. So however long you take to answer the question is absolutely fine. Well, we haven't got hundreds of questions. We've kept it a relatively small number. What was your reaction when you heard about the recent war?
It was total paralysis. I couldn't move. Couldn't move, but at the same time I was hysterical. It's the worst of your nightmares coming true, because every Armenian who lived there and Armenians in Armenia, they were aware that the war is always a possibility. And having also studied that region, I knew that Azerbaijan has been long preparing for a war. This time they've also been very much aggressively supported by Turkey, who seems to be, let's say, very active in a lot of military combat in the Middle East, in North Africa. So it's not that you were surprised necessarily, but it still comes as a surprise, because after the first war, I always had this thought that the war might happen again. And what would that mean for my family and the children of the previous war will now be going to fight in this war as a grown-up man, including my brother. And it's been my worst nightmare. So I always put that back as something in my head, that it can't happen, it can't happen. So when it happened, yeah, you have a physical reaction of your life just stops, and my life did stop for 6 weeks. And afterwards, something even worse has happened. So I found it very difficult to sit. I live in Amsterdam with my family and work in Nottingham. And it's just, you realize that you are physically here, but you are not here at all. It was a whole new sensation to me, that whatever it is, your soul, your mind is somewhere else, and the physical reality around you, that doesn't matter anymore. So it has been a very strange time. It's very difficult for my husband, because he was also very much affected by it and worried about my family, and he had to support me. So we've been through, it's also a test to our marriage, that you can support each other through something like this. Yeah.
Can I ask a follow-on question from that? I mean, did you feel that you would really like to sort of completely up sticks and go back to Armenia to join your family?
Yeah, all those thoughts cross your mind every minute, because you have an incredible sense of guilt for being away and being in safety. And what also made this war very cruel for people who have, for Armenians around the world watching it, is that you could watch the whole war in real time. Everything was broadcasted online, so I was in real time watching bombs falling over my parents' house, knowing that my dad, my younger brother, are sitting in the bunker. So that does something to you that you, yeah, it's very difficult to describe. And I had this immense sense of guilt that I'm far away, sitting in safety, and can I be there? Can I just sit next to them, even though I'll be as helpless as they are? But obviously I knew that won't help anybody, and I stayed still. Yeah, but the thoughts were there, of course, to join them.
Nara,
Thank you.
can I ask next question? How was your family affected by the recent war, and what are the consequences of this war for your family and for other families in the same circumstances?
Thank you, Tanjka. Well, my family has everybody who lives in Nagorno-Karabakh has been immediately affected from day one, because they woke up on Sunday morning very early to the sound of bombs, and because they directly bombarded Stepanakert quite heavily, it became very clear that this is a full-scale war, and it's very dangerous. So in early days, they evacuated, many families have evacuated women and children to Yerevan, including my mother, my sister-in-law, and my niece. And my mother has a reaction after the first war and her experiences. She basically saved my father in the first war, taking him out of ruins and finding a way of getting him to hospital, and even though she was wounded herself. So she cannot hear those sounds anymore. She goes into some sort of a strange state. So my brothers and my father made her leave as well, which was also very difficult for her to sit in Yerevan, while my dad and my brother stayed in Stepanakert for 4 or 5 weeks under the bombs. And I actually, the photographs, and there was a lot of journalistic evidence of the bombardments, of the aftermath of the bombs published, and I could recognize my street online, and that is also very it's difficult to describe what it does to somebody. By one week before the war, they evacuated most of the civilian population in Stepanakert. So my father was evacuated then, and my brother apparently also had health issues, so he was allowed to leave to go to doctor in Yerevan. He needs a surgery. At the moment when the so-called peace agreement was signed, they were all in Yerevan, and but I had other family members there, including my cousin who was fighting in the war, the son of my other cousin. They are all fortunately alive. The situation is such at the moment that my city is under Russian control, so to speak. However, it's just unimaginable that it's safe. The way to Karabakh is no longer safe. People have disappeared actually from the road. Nothing is clear about the arrangements there, who protects whom. If you come back to Stepanakert, can you travel back to Armenia? Can you even go to the next residential point? And whose military posts you will be crossing, the Russians, the Azeris? So my family is not at all keen to go back, because they cannot imagine a future, particularly for my brother, for people with children who grew up themselves as children in the war and then had the threat of the war hanging over their heads. And it's not just a one-off. This was periodically happening. For my younger brother, who served 2 years in the army, it was a very dangerous experience. Subsequently, when the situation would periodically worsen, twice he had gone back as a volunteer to the active combat, and it's just a nightmare to live in that state of mind. And he says, I don't want the same for my children. And so, and yeah, it's difficult for them to go back to live. Another complicating factor is Nagorno-Karabakh has two big cities. One is Stepanakert, another one is the city of Shushi, which you probably saw. And this peace agreement was concluded after they said Azerbaijan had captured the city, even though it wasn't necessarily the case. Point is, as a result of this agreement, they have given Azerbaijan control over the city. So they've taken the city back and they view it as their cultural center. And nobody mentions that this was actually a cultural center for Caucasus entirely and for its Armenian population. It has the Armenian cathedral, which has been bombed with precise targeted rockets, injuring journalists, Russian journalists. And nobody mentions what this city actually meant for Armenians. So historically, this was one of the strongholds and cultural centers of various people, Armenians. Just as an example, by 1920, had 19 newspapers in that city out of 21 that were published there. 19 were published in Armenian. There were 5 publishing houses in Armenian. 8 hotels, and it was a major cross point in the South Caucasus. But there were 20,000 Armenians were massacred in Shushi in 1920, including members of my family. And so Armenians never recovered during the Soviet rule in terms of numbers or what the city meant to them. But more close to our history, or myself, for instance, is the fact that from that city, we were relentlessly bombarded for many months, over a year. And when that city was, Armenians liberated it, they thought in 1992, it meant that for us, the bombardments of Stepanakert have stopped. And that was a major, and we could go back to Stepanakert until they started bombing us from airplanes. What I'm trying to say is that it's very difficult to imagine living in Stepanakert with Shushi being in their hands, because the cities are 10-15 minutes drive away from each other. And this is Shushi, this is Stepanakert. They can literally see through into your houses. For people living in Stepanakert, and many mistrust Russians, some think it's a good thing that the Russians are there. Many others do not trust the Russian soldiers will be actually efficient or keen to keep it peaceful, or ensure safety for the population. And given the incredible hatred that has been cultivated towards Armenians for 3 decades, it's very difficult to imagine living people side by side without major work having been done on state level, on diplomatic level. So that is the situation of my family. So far, they think they cannot go back to their homes, and it's also not clear that they have a future in Armenia proper. So they find themselves in the same shoes probably that many Armenians did centuries, through centuries, that they had to leave their homes.
Thank you, Nara. Just before I ask you the next question, if I can remind people who've joined us a bit late, if you want to ask a question, can you please put it on the chat, and then Tanya or I will choose which questions are going to be asked. And similarly, if you're on the live stream, if you can put it in the comment box underneath the video, then we'll be able to pick it up from there as well. So I'm just going to go back. So the next question really, I noticed when I was doing a bit of reading before this evening, that in 2005, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe adopted a resolution 1416, which condemned ethnic cleansing against Azerbaijanis. And similarly, in May 2010, there was another resolution passed about a need for an EU strategy for the South Caucasus. And the resolution stated in particular that the occupied Azerbaijani regions around Nagorno-Karabakh must be cleared as soon as possible. And they then, in January 2016, adopted Resolution 2085, which deplored the fact that the occupation by Armenia of Nagorno-Karabakh and other adjacent areas of Azerbaijan created conflict and problems with refugees. Now that's one perspective, and I was particularly interested, having read that, given your research area into EU law, what you felt about the role of the EU or the Council for Europe, which isn't actually quite the same, in terms of the conflict.
Thank you for your question. I think I'll have to unpack it a little bit, talking about those documents and also what any of these organizations could have done or could do now. Now, from the moment on when Azerbaijan started collecting oil revenues, that is when major pipelines were built passing from Azerbaijan through Georgia and Turkey to Europe, they have put in a lot of diplomatic work to promote a particular perspective on the conflict, whereby the issue of Azerbaijani refugees, over 500,000 Azerbaijani refugees as a result of the conflict, has taken center stage. And they have managed to pass these resolutions in the Council of Europe, in the General Assembly of the UN later on, even though this was condemned by countries like the US, France, and Russia, who were the co-chairs of this group, which was in charge of negotiating a solution, a peaceful solution to the conflict. What I can say about those documents is that they were very successful in presenting that picture. As you will see, no word mentioned there about 400,000 Armenians that have been ethnically cleansed from Azerbaijan, which was also start of the military phase of the conflict, when pogroms of Armenians were organized in various cities of Azerbaijan, including its capital, which were so devastating that the Soviet army had to come into Baku to stop it. So civilian population on both sides have been, of course, affected terribly, but there is a cause and effect. So the refugees from those surrounding territories have, of course, were one of the issues that have been part of the negotiation process. And those territories were the only thing that Armenia, or the Armenian side, because I should separate Nagorno-Karabakh from Armenia, Nagorno-Karabakh had its own political system for the last 30 years, even though in media you do not necessarily see this distinction. They just say Armenia controls it, and that is not at all correct. So that was one of the issues that was subject to negotiation. What happens to the status of Nagorno-Karabakh? How can you secure the safety of its Armenian population? Return of the territories surrounding Nagorno-Karabakh, and the return of the refugees. So when you take just that one question out of the context and present it, and Armenia becomes, obviously, if you just look as a matter of the facts, then you say Armenians control those territories, therefore they are the aggressor. So diplomatically, Azerbaijan has completely won that war up to today, including in international media, where you see unequivocal statements about very complex matters presented in a very simple manner, which suits one particular side. Another thing, just to point out, a few years ago, there has been a major investigation by international media, including The Guardian, about Azeri laundromat, where many European politicians, including those sitting in the Council of Europe and its parliamentary assembly, were literally bought by Azerbaijan. You might want to Google it. And that might also explain quite a few reports like that, which came out, and some reports which were not allowed to pass in the Council of Europe, condemning Azeri political record, which has been run as an autocracy for some decades now. Just to put that in the context, how come these resolutions appeared? And in fact, those, as I said, who were in charge of resolving the matter were always condemning of such efforts to take one issue out of context and present in that light. In terms of what these organizations can do, well, it has been very disturbing to see the behavior of the European Union. And this is my area of expertise, because the European Union has many values with which it should be guided by in its relations with third countries, including its neighboring countries. Armenia and Azerbaijan form a part of the so-called Eastern Partnership, where the EU cooperates with them to develop them, to bring them perhaps closer economically, if possible. But it has to be based on the European Union values, which include human rights, which include democracy, rule of law, respect for the rights of minorities, etc. From the start of the war, where it's called conflict, but it's a full-fledged war with state-of-the-art weapons, where you used against civilians, soldiers, and it's also accepted as a matter of fact, nothing to question there. But that use of force, even if you claim that you are just taking back your territories, it is illegal under international law. It actually goes against the main framework that was adopted by the UN to hold hostilities in the first war. So even with such obvious facts that one party starts war with the support of Turkey, an EU candidate member state, open support of Turkey, from the first week of the war, various states, the United States, including France, so a member state of the European Union, confirmed that Turkey was systematically bringing Syrian mercenaries and terrorists to fight on the side of Azerbaijan, which is also a breach of international law. And have we seen any of this in any action? So there was no action taken by the European Union whatsoever. You simply had statements calling on both parties to stop fighting, even though for one party, for the Armenian soldiers, to putting their weapons down would have meant massacre of civilians. There has been no doubt about that. And many war crimes have already been committed in the 6 weeks of war. And no mention of Turkey whatsoever, no condemnation of hiring mercenaries, which have given evidence that every cut Armenian head would be worth an extra $100. So the European Union has behaved in the same way as it did in the 1990s with the Balkan Wars and also the First Karabakh War. It had no role whatsoever to play apart from humanitarian aid. And that is very sad to see for an EU scholar, because constitutionally the European Union has developed significantly in the last 3 decades to be able to play a role. But it was unwilling to do so for many reasons. And one of them is, of course, the realpolitik, so geopolitical considerations. Azerbaijan has oil. It's a more important partner than Armenia is. The European Union, until today, there was a resolution passed in the European Parliament against to impose sanctions on Turkey because of their threats to Greece and Cyprus. But generally, you see a very passive attitude towards Turkey in the last 4 years for the reason of the refugee deal that they made with Turkey. Turkey keeps the Syrian refugees, 3.5 million of them or more, for which it gets money, and then it gets to blackmail the European Union in the last 4 years. Hence, Turkey was free to engage in Syria, commit incredible crimes against the Kurdish people who actually helped to fight the ISIS there. When the Americans left, and they left also the Kurds to the mercy of Erdogan in Syria. They're actively involved in Iraq. They're actively involved in Libya. And therefore, they thought what's stopping them from getting involved in Azerbaijan. And indeed, after this war, Turkey was also keen to bring its troops there. So they passed a law in their parliament last week. So they will station their own troops in Nagorno-Karabakh. And just as a little bit of a context. So imagine for Armenians having Turkish army anywhere near Armenian population in Nagorno-Karabakh. The trauma of that is also very difficult to describe. So just for a second, imagine that Germany has never acknowledged the Holocaust, not only did not acknowledge, did not take responsibility for it, but actively denied it, spend a fortune on think tanks and I don't know what, to promote Armenian genocide denial policies, and then suddenly also said, we're openly going to help enemies of Israel to get territories back or whatever it is they might want to do. So that is why for also Armenians who have been born in diaspora, who are descendants of the Armenian genocide, the 6 weeks of the war and afterwards have been nothing short of a nightmare. And the threat is still hanging because for Azerbaijan, with this, as I kept referring to organized Armenophobia, and it's organized to an extent where on their versions of world map, Armenia doesn't exist. They call it West Azerbaijan. And Erdogan this year has been, most recently actually during the war, was making speeches about finishing what their grandfathers have started in the South Caucasus. And there is no two way of interpreting it. It's only one way of interpreting it, particularly if you're Armenian. So to see all of this, and it's all widely documented, including the international crimes, war crimes committed have all been documented in the European Court of Human Rights. Armenia has launched many interim measures to protect the civilian population that came under their control, to protect the prisoners of war, some of them who have been summarily executed on camera. They still have a role to play, but the European Union has been tragically absent from this conflict, which therefore opened also the space for Russia to do what it did in this deal that they have made in the middle of the night, basically leaving half of the population without homes and the other half destined to leave the place, because it's very clear that that place might become just a Russian military base. It's not a place where you want to have a future. You can imagine raising children there.
Thank you. Sorry, that was a bit of a googly, but I think thank you for answering it in such a thorough way. I think Tanya's going to ask you the next question.
Yeah, I want to thank you for this answer as well. Obviously, it wasn't covered as well by the media, so it's great to hear your answer in terms of the European Union involvement from a professional and also personal point of view. But what I want to ask you, why this conflict? Why did this war happen now?
Well, it has been very well calculated in many ways. As I said, Azerbaijan has been preparing for war for a long time. And this year it was very clear that they have Turkish support, and Turkey, Erdogan for the last 10 years has been quietly and not so quietly promoting his vision of what Turkey's role in the world is. And it's the same vision that young Turks had who ruled Turkey 100 years ago and also organized the Armenian genocide. And that is to create a pan-Turkic and pan-Islamic belt. So create this belt where Armenia has always been a thorn. It just stands in the way. And something that they haven't succeeded in doing 100 years ago when Armenia became Sovietized, and chunk of it was saved by the Russians, the rest has been given to Turkey, parts of it given to Azerbaijan. And the same now, Armenia is just an obstacle on the way. And as I said, Erdogan has successfully managed to get away with many atrocities committed in Syria, in Libya, in Iraq, against the Kurdish, Assyrian populations. And then why not here as well? So with this support, Azerbaijan also felt strongly enough to breach all international conventions, disregard 3 ceasefires negotiated by Russia, France, US, and the timing was perfectly calculated. It was the entire world is distracted by COVID, and this was pre-American elections. They knew Trump couldn't care less. In fact, he's quite close. He has ties to Erdogan, to the ruling regime in Azerbaijan. He profits from it financially with his franchises, etc. He has bank loans from Turkey, which were also problematic in US. Nonetheless, it was very clear that there was no strong hand internationally to stop it. And Russia was the only one which could have done that. Russia as an ally of Armenia. Russia has military agreements also with Armenia as its security guarantor, but somehow it decided not to intervene to stop the war, because that wouldn't have given it a mandate to bring its army, which is, according to experts, is the only vision that Russia has with which this conflict could have ended, to have its army there, and it doesn't matter on whose side. So it probably allowed the conflict to reach such a state where Azerbaijan would be happy enough for the Russian army to be stationed there. Yeah, so Turkey is not happy about that its army is not there, and it decided that unilaterally it will bring its army to the territory of Azerbaijan.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to ask you what is the last of the 6 questions we sent you earlier. Hopefully there will be some more questions from people watching. Do you think there was another way to solve the conflict? And there's 2 parts to this question, really. And do you think you can compare the situation in Nagorno-Karabakh and the relationship between the 2 sides of the conflict to other conflicts like that between Israel and the Palestinians, between the English and the Irish, Pakistan and India, if you want to elaborate? I think there is a common theme actually to all of those, but do you think there was another way to solve it?
Yeah, of course. I think the conflict is on the conscience of everybody who was in power in Armenia and in Azerbaijan, and as well as the international community, because everybody has been complacent. The Armenian side has been complacent in the sense that they did not undertake significant diplomatic effort. They thought that the status quo suits them, and they have the Russian protection. And 2 consecutive presidents of Armenia who ruled the country for 20 years were quite close to the regime of Vladimir Putin, and they did think that the bonds are so strong that nobody would dare to start a war on this scale. I think the best time of solving the conflict was in the 1990s, when the territories could have been returned for status of Nagorno-Karabakh and security guarantees. But that did not happen. There are also many versions as why not, whether Russia didn't allow it to happen because Russia was keen to have this conflict as unresolved, whereby it could exercise leverage over Armenia and Azerbaijan. And it did actually for 26 years, until it's miscalculated that there might be other powerful actors in the region, including Turkey, who decide that this balance of powers is no longer suitable for their interests. So the conflict, I think if it was resolved in 1990s, it wouldn't have led to such hatred of Armenians in Azerbaijan, because the people who have been born after that conflict have never met any Armenian. From very early age, they are taught that Armenians never existed anywhere in the region before. They are monsters and all sorts of insanities. And it's at this stage, whether it could have been prevented, to have a complete, to prevent it completely, I think it had already gone too far. It was very clear that war was going to happen. And while Azerbaijan was very active, making allies all over the world, using the resources that they had, Armenia has been very weak and very naive, I think, as well, to put all its eggs in one basket and hope that Russia would not let something like this happen. But they have miscalculated. Comparing these conflicts to others, of course, the basic line is the same. Can two different people decide to live together when they are actually perhaps not so different in terms of what they eat, how they dance? They might have a lot of commonalities culturally as well. And my grandparents, my grandmother, for instance, was born and raised in Baku. My uncles were born in Baku. Many members of my family lived and prospered in Azerbaijan because that was where they lived historically as well. But suddenly there was the possibility of igniting such hatred over a night, over a day, that people had to leave everything behind and run away for their life. At the moment, it's how things have been in the last 26 years. Things can change if you acknowledge what were the mistakes of the past in both sides. If you do not do that, especially if you have a corrupt political regime and autocracy where minorities are nobodies, and I'm not only talking about Armenians, but all other minorities, many other minorities in Azerbaijan, including Lezgins and Talish, who are not allowed to speak in their language or study in their language or have any media in their own language. It's very difficult to imagine a future and suddenly to say, oh, let's look at this as an opportunity, because it's another major historical injustice, at least how it is perceived by majority of Armenians around the world. And knowing that you are hated so much, there is no trust whatsoever to imagine that suddenly you can live peacefully next to each other without major political transformation. Yeah. I hope that answers your question. I might have.
No, thank you. It does. Yeah, thank you. That was as I said, it was a two-pronged question, so I think that was really an excellent answer. Thank you. Right, I think that's all the questions that Tanya and I had asked. Tanya, is there anything else that you wanted to come back on?
Yeah, well, I was wondering. I mean, first of all, it's been fascinating. Thank you so much for talking to us tonight and giving us more details about the conflict, but also about the history of the conflict and looking at it behind the scenes, because lots of information is not available online. But what I wonder, why did Russia behave in the way it behaved this time? Being so close to Russia, as you said, and that was a mistake on the part of the Armenian government, but why wouldn't they be interested in a part of the, geopolitically?
Yeah, it has been in a way it has been very shocking to see, simply because of the agreements that Russia had with Armenia, where it's obliged to guarantee the security of Armenia, and Russia used the pretext, the technicality that technically this is happening not on Armenian territory, even though it's Armenian conscripts as well dying in the war, so we're not interfering. And that was also a lie, because the territory of Armenia itself was attacked with rockets, with drones, including over the Russian military base. Russia has 2 military bases in Armenia, and they shot those drones down. But there was no mention of this. And the Russian helicopter came down with Russian pilots. 2 Russian pilots died. So it was very clear that Russia was keen to stay out of it. One version is that it did not want to go into open military confrontation, not only with Azerbaijan, but also Turkey, because Turkish officers and mercenaries hired by them were involved in the war very clearly. Another version is that Russia was stretched. It's in Syria, it has East Ukraine, so in Donbass, where hostilities might flare up again. It has Belarus to watch over, instability in Kyrgyzstan, and having a full-fledged war where Russia has to bring its combat army was not desirable. And Putin speaks very highly of Mr. Erdogan. They had their fallouts periodically, but then they patched things up because they decide to share territories, which they've done in Syria. You give me this, I give you that. So for Russia and Assad's regime, it suited that Erdogan might clear the northern part from Kurds, as shameful as it is. There is another theory that Russia disliked the new Armenian government, which came to power through a peaceful revolution, and this was a way of punishing them. But as I said, experts who know the region very well and who have been interviewing the high upper echelons of Russian military and diplomatic circles said always that the only way that Russia can see this conflict resolved is by having its boots on the ground, and it doesn't matter from whose side. So it probably suited Russia to escalate things to an extent where Armenia would be in such horrible conditions that it would accept the Russian military there, and Azerbaijan would be quite happy, and they were happy by gaining particularly the city of Shushi and half of Nagorno-Karabakh proper, that they agreed to this. And they say that Putin did not give the president of Azerbaijan time to agree this with Erdogan, and Erdogan was very unhappy with this solution. Yeah, but for Armenian people, historically, we have many pages in our history throughout centuries where Armenian territories were either in Iran or Turkey, and then Tsarist Russia. And in Tsarist Russia, Armenians were safer, just as fellow Christian people, while they were persecuted in Turkey. And few times when Armenians helped Russia to conquer the Western Armenia, which now is Anatolia, Eastern Turkey, then Russia exchanged these territories for some other more suitable territories like Crimea. It's something in our history, and it's 100 years ago, Ataturk and Lenin also made a deal where the majority of historical Armenian homeland went to Turkey. That was a gift from Lenin to Ataturk, because Lenin considered at the time that Turkey has a potential of becoming a communist country and would become a natural ally in the fight against the capitalist West. And he miscalculated big time. But in any case, the Armenians, survivors of the genocide who actually went back to live on those territories because it was under Russian control, had to leave their houses again if they were alive. And it's been yeah. So we all, I think my generation understood a lot more of our history on our own skin. You felt it a lot differently, including myself. Many things I couldn't understand. I couldn't also. For many years, I couldn't understand the fixation of the Armenian diaspora with why the Armenian genocide is not recognized. Because there has been a movement in Armenia to normalize the relations with Turkey without recognizing the genocide. And for diaspora, that was just madness. And only through this war, I actually understood why. That it's difficult it's just impossible, because that major injustice has done to you has met such impunity that the same can happen again. And we all saw that nobody would lift a finger. If the Armenian soldiers didn't fight, if the population wasn't evacuated, the same thing would have happened and the world wouldn't have lifted a finger. So my father, who obviously has a whole different set of experiences from the previous war as a grown-up, I thought he was very nationalistic. He had an irrational fear of Turkey, the Turks. And only now I understood that actually his fear was not irrational at all. It was his lived experience. It was the lived experience of his previous generations, his family. And he had a reason to fear them. And his entire life has been marked by what happened in the past. And so I understood a lot of things through my own, grown-up experiences.
It's
that
very
I've done before.
You know, it's very, very difficult because my heart, you know, just goes out to you, you know, all the people who've just been suffering recently, because there's a Jewish person I understand. That's exactly what happened during Holocaust. And it's, you know, the suffering doesn't end up with the generation who went through the Holocaust. It touches, I mean, obviously we know through epigenetics, second and third generation. And that's why it's so difficult for some people, particularly in this country, when we had to deal with anti-Semitism on the left, was really difficult to understand. People were asking me, why Jews make such a big deal about this? And I was trying to explain, because of the lived experience of generations, which is sort of in the, you know, in the national memory, any little anti-Semitism which can lead to, you know, to pogroms or extermination or destruction, it creates a lot of fear. So
the line is very fine. You understand that the line is fine between just simple, you know, of what you might consider as an outsider, as, you know, it's simple something. Why are you offended at that? But from your lived experiences, you know that the line between saying somebody is less than a human and then killing them in the most horrible way, it's very easy to cross that line once you dehumanize another person.
Absolutely, because the trauma is still there. And what was really interesting from what you've said is how, because, you know, I do think whether we ever can stop at least this part of suffering, how can we all live in peace? And I know it sounds unrealistic, but then what are we living for? How is it possible that nations are already brought up in hatred and all the, you know, all the conflicts around the world? What was interesting, you said that it's about acknowledging long-standing conflicts and mistakes and wrongdoings on both sides. And the challenge, of course, that people in power are not going to do that. So it's all down to real people who want to live in peace and who want to bring their children in peace as well. And that's this talk, this, you know, small contribution to opening the conversation about how we can bring peace. We people who with our families want to live in peace. I don't want any destruction happening in the world. And we don't want human beings to suffer in the second and third generation after our families survive horrible atrocities. So thank you.
Nara, can I ask you, just, are you open to any more questions if anybody watching has a question?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, my
Yeah.
evening is
good. So if people can raise a hand, either physically raise it or use the raise hand thing. So if anybody wants to ask a question.
Doris, please. Doris, you need to unmute yourself.
Yeah. So,
Tanya, I thought it was a wonderful idea, a wonderful program, but we could not hear most of it. Now, whether that's us or you, I don't know, but it was very upsetting that we could not hear or understand most of what was said. And we didn't understand the problems, the adverts that came in the middle of it.
There's nothing to do with it.
But we just could not understand what was going on.
Or
Is that us, or
it.
is the sound from you?
I don't know, Doris. Maybe it's our accents. Maybe it's Nara's and my accents.
No,
That's not the way. I'm joking. The good news is that it's been recorded. So Doris, you and Peter will be able to watch it afterwards. And if you have any questions, I'm sure Nara will be happy to answer after we'll watch it. And
yes, so I'm watching it live on my computer and on Facebook with my left eye on my iPad, and it's 15 seconds delay between the two, but it is all there. David, you wanted to ask something. Do you want to unmute yourself, please?
I just wanted to say that we heard every word like you, and it was very clear. And thank you very much for telling us of the plight of the Armenians. We hope things will one day get better. And how sad it is that the EU doesn't give proper support, which it should do, being a civilized nation, when terrorism like that rears its ugly head. And also the United Nations, which is quite useless. It surely was brought into being for such an occasion like this, and it always takes the wrong side or does nothing. Thank you very much for a wonderful insight. I'm just sorry to hear what you had to say.
Thank you. That's very kind of you. And yeah, indeed.
Well, yeah, I'm going to wrap it up because unless anybody else, oh, Bruce, you wanted to speak. Yeah, please.
Firstly, I want to apologize sincerely that I misunderstood the time. I completely overlooked so narrow. I've missed 20-25 minutes of what you may have said, and I won't say looking forward to catching up, but I will be interested to catch up, because from what I caught of what you were saying, it was a very, very powerful testimony. And I want to thank you for putting yourself in such a position to share this. I wanted to pick up on the comment about lived experience and how your father, you couldn't understand your father's nationalism and hostility towards the Turks. Do you feel that history never quite repeats itself, but it does kind of echo or rhyme with the past, the present rhymes with the past? And the genocide of a century ago, the older I get, the more I realize how recent it was. And, you know, this kind of from generation to generation, this fault line around that particular region where Islamic expansionism, geopolitical considerations, ethnic diversity and conflict has again erupted at a time of unrest. I mean, it doesn't, forgive me for, I'm ranting a little bit, sort of not really formulating, but here we are in a pandemic when actually the last genocide took place during a pandemic. And whenever there is a crisis, an international global crisis or regional crisis, somehow it brings out the worst in some and the best in others. And I wonder what you think we could do now in order to help raise awareness of the situation, apart from just writing to MPs who just seem to have their own agendas. Well, Turkey, you may have mentioned this earlier, but of course, one of the reasons I think why the West, for what it is, didn't and doesn't raise its criticism of Turkey is because, of course, it's a NATO country. And it makes it very, very uncomfortable for NATO leaders to recognize that they've got a fascist in its own setup who is bent on genocide. So what can we do to actually raise awareness or support the people in their difficulty? I'm sorry it ranted a little bit, but what can we do?
Thank you very much. It's the million-dollar question that we're all asking ourselves, because from early days, you know, fighting as we were all in a very strange emotional state, and this physical paralysis, trying to reach out, right to politicians, to international organizations, all seemed to have been useless in many ways. So in a country like the UK, which is a very close ally of Turkey and Azerbaijan, writing to MPs was, it's also something me and my friends who live in the UK tried to do, but of course it's useless. In fact, in the middle of the war, Dominic Raab came out with some wonderfully supportive message of Turkey, and the same for NATO. It's been very difficult to watch and answer questions, including from my parents. Where do you see now that there is no international community? Do you see that none of those organizations matter? And of course I could see, and I had no answer. So I myself am at a loss as to what to do, because I might have become even more cynical that all that seems to matter now is money, oil, power, pure power and nothing else, even for organizations in which I fundamentally believe, like the European Union. You understand that there are some interests which prevail over values. And that is very sad to see in this century, in 21st century, after everything that people around the world, but also Europe has been through, and you thought they did acknowledge, they did learn from their past, but suddenly the same can happen again, maybe in some different form to some other or people or some people again, but the same can happen again. And the international organizations that have been created to prevent that, as you said, they are useless. They are not efficient. They have been created in a way to cater to the interests of the powerful countries, those who came out triumphant after the Second World War, and they are in perpetual stagnation in the sense of decision-making or upholding their own basic norms written in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, so on and so forth. So it is a very, I mean, not only this war, but so many things that have been happening in the last decade or so, 2 decades, demonstrate that international law is in crisis. There has to be a major revision of it, whereby it can actually work for the little people, the people who don't have the might on their side, economic, be it, or military. And I'm talking now as, you know, last week or 2 weeks ago, Turkey was preparing another offensive against the Assyrians in Iraq, the Kurds. And it's just, and you don't see this in the media. It's just nowhere to be found. If you're not looking for this news, these are not news. Instead, the news is, you know, another silly tweet from President Trump or some incredible non-stories take a front page while so much around the world is happening and it's not covered because it just doesn't follow the clickbait logic. It puts people off. This is not a subject that makes you happy, right? Sitting at home, you'd rather watch some celebrity reality TV show. So I'm also at a loss as to what to do, and myself, I find it very difficult that I will have to teach European Union law next semester. Including European Union international relations. And I have to, in my head, I go a lot over it, that I'm trying to convince myself that I have to do it, or I find a reason to do it. But I am also at a loss as to what to do. Emotionally, it's very difficult for me even to process news. I'm taking a little bit of a distance now because I think psychologically, I've been close to a point where I understood how people go crazy, how you're close to lose your sanity. Because I asked my husband, who is Dutch, that when is the last time you worried about your mother or your sister or their families? And he said, never. And I said, my whole life, since the age of 6, 7, I have been worried about where I lived, about my family, and afterwards, even when I migrated, economically, and the threat of the war and everything. And now to think that my family is, at this age, my parents are 65, my 2 brothers have children, and they have no home. They have no jobs. Only one of my brothers has, and it's not clear if his job will continue. And they have no prospects because it's also, Armenia will be in a very difficult situation economically, politically. There will be a new wave of migration. So this perpetual worry about your people generally, but more closely about your immediate family. And it's not only my parents, but my uncles, my cousins. So all of them now with kids are somewhere else. So I'm afraid, I'm sorry, I can't say this is a way to help, but maybe contributing to organizations like the Red Cross, which do humanitarian relief or retrieve the bodies of soldiers. The work is still ongoing, or demine the area where people explode. In fact, my school years were also marred by that. This person exploded on a mine, that child exploded on a mine. So I would say supporting those organizations would be a worthy cause, because the consequences of this will still live with people for a long time.
Rosemary, if we can have yours, and that'll be the last question, I think.
Okay, I think you've probably answered my question, which is there must be some organisations that are helping in some way. The Red Cross is one, but if we knew which organisations, we could support them. And thank you very much for your talk, because it's been really interesting and informative and very, very sad. But yeah, wish you all the best.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nara. Just before we finish, could I just say that I've got a few messages from people who are watching it on YouTube saying thank you so much for your talk, and that their hearts goes out to your people and to you, Nara, and all your community as well. So that's lovely.
That's very kind.
And maybe you can send us the link of an organization or the organizations who, you know, then people can make contribution for all the work they're doing to help now all the refugees.
Yeah, I'll send it to you by email, Tanya. I'd like to thank you, Tanya, for organizing this, and Mike as well for chairing. It's been very kind of you to raise awareness, because yeah, there's a lot more you could have been doing on your Thursday evenings. So thank you very much, and thank you to everybody who joined and who has been watching and asking questions. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
I was doing a little reading prior to this evening, and one of the things that came out is it's clear that, like many parts of Central Europe, the land now known as Nagorno-Karabakh has been at war for over 2,000 years. In fact, some of it went back to pre-Christian times. The area was more recently, the Middle Ages, under Ottoman rule. And this is a bit that fascinated. Like many areas of conflict, the area became under the control of Great Britain. And perhaps we need to have another conversation about the role of Great Britain in current areas of conflict around the world, because it seems to feature in many of them: India, Pakistan, Israel, Palestine, other parts of the Middle East. I think we'll all be impressed by the bravery of Nara in being able to speak this evening. The conversation was set up before the peaceful solution, or not really a peace and not a solution, that's been done, which has meant the loss of her family home, and, as she's explained, the risk to her own family. So thank you so much, Nara, for giving us your time and under really very difficult circumstances. And like you, I wanted to thank everybody who's taken part this evening, who's listened, who's been involved. And I hope this will just be the first of several conversations. So thank you all very much. And thank you, Tanya, for organizing it.
And thank you, Mike, for chairing it. It's been great working together. And thank you very much, everyone who joined us on live platforms. Thank you for joining. Have a good evening.
Indeed. Thank you very much. Good night.
Good night, Nara.